Most people do not go into therapy, Lila, when they're adults because they didn't feel loved. Most people come into therapy because they feel their parents didn't understand them. Somewhere along the way, we got confused that the way to create successful children was to force cognitive learning into them at a young age. And then when they get older, we infantilize them. We treat them like they're babies and we baby them. We have to reverse that back. I think what most parents think is, I'm going to be there when I want to be there, and my child has to be there on my terms. The way that you get close to your children is by being around enough you catch the wave.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Lila Rose podcast. Today we have a major treat. We're going to have Erica Komisar back on the podcast. You may remember Erica Komisar as our special guest a few months ago. Her episode went very viral online, and we got thousands and thousands of messages and feedback from many of you talking about how her words truly touched your life, and for some of you even changed your life. Our conversation was about the power and the importance of mothers, especially mothers being there for their very young children, and how in the crazy modern world, it is valuable, so valuable, for mothers, fathers, and families to make sacrifices or hard choices to ensure that mothers can maximize the time that they are there with their young children. Today, we're going to have her back on the show to take questions. I've received hundreds and hundreds of questions from many of you that you would like to ask Erica. So we're going to actually be asking her more detailed questions about her perspective on this as a psychoanalyst. We're also going to talk about how to heal wounds that we may have with our children, or how to overcome difficulties we may have in parenting our young children, what to do if you are a working mom or you were a mom that worked when your kids were young and you're concerned it might have in some way damaged them or hurt them as they're getting older, ways to repair relationships, strengthen relationships, including with older children. There's a lot to unpack in this episode. I hope you enjoy it. And as always, don't forget to subscribe to the show if you aren't already on podcast apps like Apple and Spotify. And don't forget to subscribe if you're listening over here on YouTube. First of all, Erica, thanks so much for joining the podcast again.
Thank you for having me.
So the Chicken Little, the Sky Isn't Falling. The whole book is for parents of now slightly older kids, how to repair maybe mistakes they feel they made, how to deal with the new age of anxiety. You said there's another title, though, that you had thought of for your book or wanted for your book. What was that?
It was meant to be called Second Chances. And the concept was that if you miss the first critical window of brain development in terms of being present for your children, that you had another opportunity to help them with things like learning to regulate their emotions and dealing with adversity. And so, yeah, it was originally called Second Chances.
I like second chances. As a parent of young kids myself, I hope for that. So the first, let's just do a quick reminder for folks. A lot of people have watched our first episode and already have read your first book. But what is this first critical window of development, as you, I think, speak about it? And then what's the next critical window of development? Give us that overview.
So the first critical window of brain development is 0 to 3. And at the end of 3 years of age, children's right brain, 85% of their right brain, or their social emotional brain, is developed. And that part of the brain is responsible for things like the ability to regulate your emotions, keeping your emotions from going too high or too low, the ability to cope with stress and adversity, the ability to form deep and meaningful relationships and read other people's social cues. These are all formed in the first 3 years through the relationship with the mother or the primary attachment figure. The second critical window of brain development is 9 to 25, or what we call adolescence. So we know that adolescence starts a lot earlier than we thought, and it ends a lot later. And we were able to understand this now because of the technology since the 1990s that helped us to actually see the brain functioning and to see that actually the adolescent brain doesn't stop its development until about 25 years of age. And so, in the first critical window of development, we call it the period of neurogenesis, which is cell growth. And if it goes well, and if mothers are really present emotionally and physically, there's a lot of cell growth. The right brain grows very active, very big. And then it needs pruning. Think about a garden that you grow, but you overgrow. And then in the second critical period of brain development, it's a period of pruning the garden. And in both of these windows of critical development, mothers and parents are really critically important to children. And if you miss the first window, you have a second opportunity in the second window to do very many of the same things you should have done in the first window, because the two periods of brain development are quite similar in many ways.
So I told folks who listen to the podcast on social media just yesterday that I would be talking to you today, and did they have questions for you? And I've gotten hundreds upon hundreds, maybe past 1,000 now, questions, comments, and direct messages. And I told them we'd be talking about this book and this idea of repair. And, one of the common questions I've gotten, I'll just share one, and it has to do with this idea of having a second chance. I've got multiple variations of this question, but one of them was, how do you heal attachment issues with a child over 3 years old? Another question similarly, if my child is 6 years old, and if I'm trying to repair the relationship now with them, how do I know if it's working? How will I know if my child has forgiven me? What are the signs? So we're not even in adolescence yet, and there's already the questions. How do we feel we made mistakes in those first 3 years? Child's 4, 5, 6, 7. What do we do?
Well, first, let me say that 3 to 9 is also a very important period of development. Because I don't include it in one of those two books doesn't mean it's not important. It's very important. It's a period of development with less emotional volatility generally. So Freud called that period the latency period, but we know that it's not latent in terms of sexual development, as he thought. But it is a quieter period, because it's a period of self-esteem building, competence building for children. So they're very focused on learning in school, cognitive learning what their strengths are, learning what their limitations and vulnerabilities and weaknesses are. And so it tends to be a less volatile period. But if you had a child where you missed that first critical window, then that period can be quite volatile, meaning that child will express the sadness, the mourning, the loss that they didn't get to experience in the first 3 years with you, right? And so, I'll use an analogy for you, or metaphor, which is if you get a hole in your socks, in the old days you used to darn them, and if you darn that sock pretty quickly, well, the hole is still pretty small, then that hole becomes stronger than the rest of the sock, that darn spot. If you let the hole get too big, it becomes too big to darn, and you can't repair it. So the concept is the sooner you get to repair, the better. So if you know at 3 years old that you weren't around enough, and you see that your child is having behavioral problems or showing signs of ADHD, which is, fight or flight, or very aggressive in school, and you take the time to pull back and say, right, I'm going to repair this. I'm going to be there for my child. I'm going to be there emotionally, physically. And you will see, as I do in my practice, that the effects are almost immediate. I mean, it's quite amazing. There's nothing magical in my work, meaning there's nothing fast or quick or magical. It takes hard work therapy. But there is something that has always been shockingly magical to me about when mothers who have been absent are home with their children more. Their children's behavior and their emotional volatility calms down like putting a salve on a burn. And so what I would say is the sooner you can get to the repair, the better. And just wait and watch how your child will respond to you in a different way, how their aggressive behavior calms down, how their distractibility may calm down, how they seem to lean into you more instead of leaning away from you. So the thing is, children are, for the most part, incredibly forgiving. If you don't overtax their capability of being forgiving, that they can be incredibly forgiving.
That is so hopeful, I know, for many people listening. And do you think that advice that you're sharing, we know we're talking about ages maybe 3 to 9, but it seems also to be part of the advice when they're in adolescence too, that returning physically and emotionally, not just quality time, but quantity time, seems to be the solution across the board?
Yes. So not just physically being around, but really learning how to be an emotionally present parent, meaning how to really reflect your child's emotions, how to be non-critical and non-judgmental, how to really see life from their perspective and be a sensitive, empathic nurturer. It doesn't mean that you don't discipline them. It doesn't mean you don't set limits. People get confused when I talk that I'm talking about, a life with no limits. But, sensitive, empathic parenting means understanding your child and all of their emotions, the whole spectrum of emotions for your child. Most people do not go into therapy, Lila, when they're adults because they didn't feel loved. Most people will come into my office and say, there are some people who say my parents didn't love me. Most people come into therapy because they feel their parents didn't understand them.
GoodRanchers.com is American meat delivered. Did you know that 90% of the meat in your grocery store doesn't come from the United States, even if the meat packages say product of the USA on it? That's a little trick that a lot of meat manufacturers use, as they import it from other countries and then they can slap on product of the USA. Not so with Good Ranchers. Good Ranchers is sourcing 100% of its meat, poultry, pork, and seafood products directly from U.S. ranchers. And you can tell by the products. The beef is just better. The chicken is delicious. You're not going to find chicken like Good Ranchers chicken at the grocery store. Usually it's stringy or it's rubbery. It's not as flavorful. Good Ranchers chicken is delicious. Good Ranchers also has a very special deal going on right now that if you order a subscription box of meat and chicken, you will get free chicken for an entire year, an additional 2+ pounds of chicken per box. You can get that great deal by using the code Lila at checkout at GoodRanchers.com. Check them out. You won't regret it. That's GoodRanchers.com, and you can use the code Lila at checkout for a year's supply of free chicken. So it's interesting what you're saying, because there was another question that I pulled that I thought was a really good one, and there were other ones similar to it, but about boundaries, because what you're describing in terms of really understanding the child's emotion, meeting them where they're at, that empathy. This was the question: how to help a child learn to respect authority. Mine don't care about any consequences, and though they're usually sweet and loving, I feel they don't respect me and walk all over me.
Well, discipline, actually the word discipline comes from the word disciple. And disciple, I guess you could say, if you think about Christ's disciples, it meant to lead by example. That's actually what the word discipline means. It doesn't mean to punish. It doesn't even mean to set limits. It means to lead by example and to help provide some structure for your child so they feel loved, so they feel safe. If we don't have any structure for children at all, they don't feel safe and they don't feel loved. So a child who's raised in an incredibly permissive environment with no intention on the part of the parent to set limits, that child often feels unloved, even ignored, right? So the idea is that discipline is first and foremost is not punishment, but it requires intention on the part of the parent. So a parent may say, stop that, Johnny. But if they don't have what I call a seriousness of intention behind their words and tone of voice and body language, often parents will be charmed by their children's bad behavior and they'll kind of giggle and laugh and say it in a not very serious way, not change the tone of their voice. And so what that does is the child gets very confusing messages. So what I would say is, if you want your children to take you seriously, first set consistent limits with them, not rigid ones, because the best limits are those that are consistent, but also flexible and individually taken into consideration, right? But seriousness of intention on the part of the parent.
So when it comes to, example, temper tantrums, or it comes to, and I'm not talking about in the first 3 years, let's say there's tantrums or just misbehavior in the, let's talk about these younger kids still. It's a lot of the audience has these younger kids, the 4, 5, 6-year-olds. What's the response? How does one handle a kid? And what does it mean too about their attachment potentially, who is not acting up every minute of every day, but regularly having the meltdowns, regularly having, spats with the sibling or spats with, in school or whatever it is. And maybe the parent's wondering, is this normal? Do I need to be more of an authoritarian here or authoritative? Or maybe I'm not giving them enough love and attention. How should parents discern that?
Well, first, I just want to define that temper tantrums are not a discipline issue. Temper tantrums are what I call an emotional blown fuse. So it's when children aren't born with the ability to regulate their emotions. They learn that through watching us regulate our own emotions and through the soothing of your child from moment to moment in those early years and the understanding of all of their emotions, including anger and fear and distress and sadness, and even excitement. We help to regulate those emotions and they learn how to regulate them. So first and foremost, it's a moment where the child has lost control of their emotions. Think of an epileptic seizure. You wouldn't say that someone who's having an epileptic seizure, it's a discipline issue. You would sit by their side, you would help them through it. So we say tantrums are not a discipline issue, right? That's the first thing. And I think that helps parents to sort of get a sense that it's not something you need to punish. The other thing is that between the ages of 2 and 6, you're really doing something that you weren't asked to do before 2. Before 2, you pooped where you wanted to poop. You ate when you were hungry. When you cried, someone picked you up. There were no boundaries, really. There were no limits. At about 2, everybody starts saying no to you and creates structure of what's appropriate and not appropriate and what you can do and can't do. And that's very hard to internalize. And so the metaphor I always use is it's like an elephant crawling through a mouse hole. That's how it feels to a child, to take in the structure for a child who's had no structure. So what a tantrum is it's sort of the conflict in a child between taking in the structure and doing what they want to do. And so there's a period where they really are out of control. It's not a discipline issue. It's an emotional regulation issue. And so if you look at it from that angle, then you're more patient, you're calmer with them, you help them through it as opposed to think of it either as a failure on your part or a failure on their part. It changes the whole paradigm of how you think about it.
One of the questions that we received and what you're describing, Erica, sounds a lot like gentle parenting is the term that's used. And there's a lot of, social media accounts and different folks talking about how to be a gentle parent. And there's, concern that, are gentle parents too permissive? Are they not training the child enough? Are they just always understanding the child to the point where there's no boundaries or limits? What's your take on gentle parenting?
Well, one's not mutually exclusive of another. You can be a sensitive, empathic parent and still have limits and still set limits. And one would say that sometimes when you set limits, your children don't like them, they get angry, that could cause a tantrum, and you're not always there to make your children happy. Sometimes what you do to keep them safe and make them emotionally healthy isn't necessarily going to make them in the moment happy. But it is your job as a parent to help them to cope with the feelings that come up for them when they're said no to. So, you can't say no to them and then blame them for their reaction to you saying no to them. If you say no to them, which we need to say no to our children, it's your responsibility as a parent to help them to learn appropriately to cope with the feelings that come out of being said no to. So, a lot of parents think that parenting ends at the word no. For me, parenting just starts at the word no.
So if you have let's say a 4 or 5-year-old who is regularly having, back to kind of the topic of misbehavior, regularly having temper tantrums, is that a sign of there's not good structure for the child where they know what's going on and so they're just maybe not prepared to deal with life as it comes at them? Or is that an attachment issue that they're displaying?
So generally, when you have a child all children have tantrums, first of all. It's very unusual to not have a child have tantrums because, as I said, it's a conflict. It's an internal conflict expressed through this blown fuse of structure and will. But so every child has tantrums. But the concept is that if a child has many tantrums, we say that they're probably a neurologically sensitive child. That should also give your listeners a different perspective, that the more sensitive, emotionally and neurologically sensitive a child is, the more tantrums they have. The harder it is to cope with frustration. So no, it's not a sign that you didn't discipline them. Sometimes if they have many tantrums, it can be a sign that you did the opposite, that you were rigid with discipline. I would say either very permissive parenting or very strict parenting can contribute to more tantrums. But tantrums themselves are usually a sign of a sensitive child. And what are other signs of a sensitive child, a neurologically sensitive child? They might be harder to soothe. They might be more sensitive to noise, to smells, to touch, to wearing clothes. So, they may have a harder time. There's the kids who may have a harder time going to a loud birthday party with 20 kids screaming and yelling, and that may trigger it. So you would say that there are children who are more sensitive to things in the environment that are felt as stressful to them.
So one of the questions I got a lot of, and and what you're saying begs it too, that this question is, how do you know then that your child may have an attachment issue that needs repair? And let's go back to tantrums for a minute. It sounds like you're describing a tantrum as sort of neurologically age appropriate, not necessarily having to do with attachment disorder. Can they be from attachment disorder? What are the red flags of attachment disorder in an older child? And then what would be the recommendation for dealing with those?
Well, I suppose the way that I would connect tantrums to attachment disorders is a disorganized attachment disorder is a child without any strategy to deal with the loss of their mother. And so they cycle through all the strategies, not being able to sort of settle on one strategy. And one of the strategies is turning away, avoidance. One is clinging, and then one is just being enraged at your mother. And so you could say that if a mother has been away a lot, or a primary attachment figure has been away a lot, and then shows up on the weekends for the kids, she's away all week, and then on the weekend she takes them to the birthday party. That child might be expressing through very intense tantrums that they've missed the mother during the week, that they're having a really hard time, that they are both feeling clingy but also angry at her. So that's a possibility. The other possibility is a child who is having an ambivalent attachment disorder, which is clinging to the mother, right? You're going to leave again. I'm never going to let you go. Let's say, again, let's use the idea of being out in the park or outside, and, the mother is with the child, but then turns away for a moment and goes to talk to a friend. And that moment of the mother pulling away could trigger that child to have a tantrum. So there are ways in which attachment disorders can be triggering of tantrums, but I would say I wouldn't necessarily make a correlation between all tantrums and attachment disorders. How we identify an attachment disorder is there's 3 attachment disorders that we know of. One is the child is not interested in the attachment figure, the mother, turns away, doesn't form a close bond, seems more interested in other people, and it has something called indiscriminate attachment. So you don't want your children to wander off and hug strangers or people they don't know very well, or take strangers' hands. So people think that's cute and charming, but actually it's the sign of an attachment disorder. Children are not meant to go up to strangers and want connection to them. So that's one sign. Another sign is if a child is incredibly clingy when you are with them, and they don't let go of you, and they're terrified of you leaving the room, or terrified of you looking away, or sensitive when you even look at your phone, or that would be another attachment disorder sign. And last but not least, the one that is the least good is disorganized. And what we see there is that cycling through, I don't care about you, mommy. Oh, mommy, don't leave me. And mommy, I hate you, sort of cycling through. And having a child who feels very almost emotionally unstable, emotionally volatile.
And are the strategies to heal the different kinds of perceived attachment disorders that you're maybe concerned your child is demonstrating to varying degrees, depending on what they're demonstrating, are the strategies different for how to heal?
No, they're not different. Presence is presence, meaning what does presence mean exactly? I mean, I wrote a whole book there's a whole chapter on what is the definition of presence, because it's a word. What it means is that you're not just physically there most of the time. You can't be there every minute, but you're not just physically present, but that you are helping your child to process their feelings, their experiences, their thoughts. So you're really think of yourself as the kidneys or the liver or the pancreas or the stomach, something that has to digest very strong feelings and experiences and help to make sense of the world. That's what mothers do from moment to moment. They're helping that child, soothing that child, but also helping that child to make sense of the world. And that's very comforting. And that actually then is internalized by that child. And so they go out into the world being able to make sense of their feelings, of the experiences, of their relationships, and make sense of the world.
Every morning when I wake up, I love to make myself a steaming cup of 7 Weeks coffee. 7 Weeks coffee is gourmet, small batch, low acid, ethically sourced coffee that is absolutely delicious. I love the Burundi blend and the Ethiopian medium blend. So many different choices at 7weekscoffee.com. What I love about 7 Weeks coffee is not just that it's delicious coffee delivered right to my door, but that 7 Weeks coffee fuels the pro-life movement. In fact, 7 Weeks' mission is to give 10% of all of its revenue, not just its profits, directly to support pregnancy resource centers. In fact, 7 Weeks Coffee has already supported 800 pregnancy resource centers, helping moms and babies in need, and donated over $325,000. At 7weekscoffee.com today, you can join the Heartbeat Club where you can get the lowest prices and the best discounts on your monthly subscription. You'll get 15% off a month, and when you use my code Lila at checkout, you'll get an additional 10% for 25% off your first order. So go to 7weekscoffee.com today, order yourself an amazing subscription of coffee, try out your favorite blend, and get 25% off your first order by using the code Lila at checkout. There was another question I wanted to be sure to bring to you, which was, it is a very heavy one. How does a mom heal her adolescent son's attachment issues if she was sick with cancer most of his childhood and he seems to be angry at her often?
Well, first and foremost, you take responsibility. She's not responsible for getting cancer, but she can take responsibility for not being there in the way that he needed her to be there. And, just saying, I'm sorry, and I mourn with you, and I'm so sorry that I wasn't there for you when you needed me. Because in the end, when we feel loss, when we feel pain, the first thing we want to know that the person that's caused the pain is making amends, can really, with integrity, take responsibility for their actions or inactions. And so that's the first step. The first step is really just holding him with her remorse, with her sadness, with her taking responsibility for what happened, and apologizing to him.
What to do if the child rejects that kind of vulnerability or doesn't want to go there with the mother or the parent?
You say, I understand that it may be too painful for you to forgive me and too painful right now. And, and I'm here for you. I'm here for you in any way that you need me. I love you. And it was not an intention to hurt you, and but it was hurtful to you. And so, and I'm here for you in any way that I can be with you.
And what does the parent do if at the same time, and I know this is the case for a lot of parents who are maybe kicking themselves for mistakes they made earlier or wondering and worrying that the attachment's not strong enough in adolescence, but now they have to also have boundaries because adolescence, I know you mentioned different stages of adolescence, but there's an exploration that happens. And so that, back to this mother, she didn't ask this as a follow-up question, but, putting myself in her shoes, she has to set boundaries for her teenage son. There needs to be a curfew, or there needs to be rules for the household, or rules for homework or for school or friends. And at the same time, he's angry with her. And he's not engaging her in this emotional way because he maybe as an attachment issue. how does a parent deal with that situation?
Well, I always say gentle but firm boundaries with adolescents and even with young children, that first you have to show empathy before you set a boundary. You know, you never want to say no to someone before you try to understand their feelings about things. So the first thing you would say is, this must be really hard for you. You know, you're 12 and I know you really want to go to that concert with your friends with no adult supervision. And that's something you really want to do. And they're all doing it. And that must be really hard for you, for us to say no to you. But we don't feel it's safe and we're going to have to say no, but it must be really hard. So before discipline, you always show empathy, whether or not a child has an attachment issue. But even more important, if they have suffered and they're young, if you've not been there or they've had losses, the sensitivity that goes into empathy before discipline. So I always say to parents, if you get one thing from sitting in my consultation room, it's that you never discipline a child without first showing empathy.
So there's many more questions, but I want to go to Chicken Little. The sky's not falling, because you provide a framework there that is really powerful. First, even helping understand what is adolescence. So you mentioned this a little earlier. Adolescence is the ages of 9 to 25. Like, people listening, 16 years of adolescence. You know, the parents listening are like, oh my gosh, that's a lot. And, you know, I hadn't heard it described that way. I know, like you said, that's newer science coming out about how the brain develops. Okay, what are the different stages of adolescence?
Well, there's 3 stages of adolescence. There's early adolescence, there's mid-adolescence, and then there's late adolescence. So early adolescence is about 9 to 13, and mid-adolescence is about 14 to 18, and then late adolescence is about 18 to 25. And just so you know, boys, it really ends closer to 28. So I want to make sure to say that with boys, it's a little later than girls. So even boys go to 28 in terms of the end of adolescence. And, you know, these 3 stages, they're different in character. The first stage is sort of marked by what I call exploration, because, you know, you're exploring your body. It's the beginning of puberty. Your body is changing. The first stage is really marked by a lot of bodily things. Puberty brings all kinds of changes that also, you know, change in mood as related to hormones. And so a lot of the first part of adolescence is a lot of self-consciousness about bodily changes. The second stage is really figuring out your identity, who you are, both sexually, gender-wise, what your strengths are, what your limitations are. You know, between 14 and 18, you realize, gosh, I'm not really great at math, so I'm probably not going to be an astrophysicist. Maybe I'm good at writing. Maybe I'm going to do something in the humanities. It's the beginning of sort of identity formation, right? 14 to 18. And it's when you figure out, am I heterosexual? And, you know, and who am I, basically, in so many ways. The last stage of development for adolescence, late adolescence, is sort of, you'd say it's the synthesis stage. It's when everything comes together and they really are, their personality settles, right? So they settle into themselves. So about by 25, they've sort of settled into who they are, and what they're good at, what they're not good at, where they're going. So those are the 3 distinct stages. There's a lot of other things that distinguish them. One thing that I think is really important for people to understand of adolescence is the middle phase of adolescence is actually one of the most vulnerable. And they're the most vulnerable to mental health issues. And I can tell you why that is. So in the middle phase, they're very focused on the present. So you'd say the first stage, you have one foot in the past to childhood, to early childhood, to childhood, and one foot in being a teenager, right? So if you know any like 12-year-olds, you'll know tween. He'll be like, you know, I'm a big boy, I'm a big girl, I'm a teenager. But then other moments, they're still like a baby and they want to curl up on the couch with you. Between 14 and 18, they're kind of very much stuck in the middle. They're not, no foot in the past, yet no foot in the future yet. And that's both a good thing and a bad thing. It's a laboratory for them to develop themselves being in the present. The problem with it is that if you're unhappy, if your social life isn't going well, if you're not doing well with your grades, you get into a kind of tunnel vision between 14 and 18 because you can't see the future yet. You can get into very depressed and even suicidal states, right? So what helps us when we're feeling down is that we can see that there'll be light at the end of the day. Tomorrow's another day. A 14 to 18-year-old cannot see the future. They get stuck in their misery in the present. Whereas an 18 to 25-year-old now has a foot in the present, but has a foot in the future, right? So they have a way out. They see, right, I'm getting out of here. I'm going to college, or I'm going to go work. I'm going to get away. I'm going to be somebody different. But that 14 to 18 period, that's the highest suicide rate for kids. And that's the period that I think it's so critical that parents are around a lot during that phase.
You had some really startling statistics in your book, especially the first part, laying out basically the new age of anxiety that we're in today. And one of them was the suicide rate in young people having tripled from 2007 to 2017. Also, the increase in young adults and adolescents being prescribed medication for mental health disorders, 400% increase in just a 3-year period, if I understood this, 2005 to 2008. You're saying there's this state of instability that happens, age 14 roughly to 18, that's sort of just based on biologically how we develop. And yet today's kids, and in recent years more than ever, are having serious mental health issues and consequences. What's going on here?
Think of it like a puzzle, a big puzzle. It's not one thing. So I know people want to be reductionistic about it and say, oh, it's social media. That did it to our kids, So social media is a piece of the puzzle. It's not the whole puzzle. I like to think of the puzzle as having a foundation. The foundation is, did you raise your children with the emotional security in the first critical window? Did you give them shock absorbers for the future? Because that's what attachment security is. All it is really are just like having shock absorbers in your car. And so if your kid experiences adversity, loss, you'd say our journey growing up is a painful one. We don't talk about it because everybody idealizes childhood and says childhood's wonderful. Actually, it's really painful growing up. So the whole experience of growing up is painful. So to be able to cope with...
Why? Why do you say that?
To be able to cope with the rejection and, the losses, we start out as children believing that we are everything, can be everything, and the world is our oyster, right? We all start out in a narcissistic state. That's normal. It's developmental. But then over time, we learn we're not the center of the universe. We learn that we have strengths, but we also have weaknesses, right? Like, I may never be a ballerina because I can't dance, but I say when I'm 3, I want to be a ballerina. So we start to understand who we are and that we're not everything to everyone in every situation. And that's a painful experience. Just that experience of having to deal with rejection and loss and, as I say, taking things off the table. Like everything's on the table when you're born, and then things come off the table, right? Maybe I'm not athletic. Maybe I'm more musical, So that experience is painful, but then childhood is painful. Socially, it's painful. And then you get to puberty and adolescence, and that's an adversity. For me, adolescence, developmentally, in a normal adolescent is an adversity. And people don't talk about it that way.
So I interrupted you with that.
Yeah,
they don't. It's true, and I think it resonates what you're saying. And from the perspective of we're born with an innocence, but with a wounded nature, and increasingly we get wounded because the world's imperfect and it's a tough place. It can be a very beautiful but tough place. So you were about to share though about the reasons for this rise or this decline, I should say, in mental health. today, and the rise in the use of drugs and all of this. I know you mentioned social media. I know you talk about many more factors in your book. What other factors, and by the way, this is a conversation people have all the time. Like, why, is it social media? You could say, is it parenting? Parents are just totally out to lunch now. Is it the soy in our food, or is estrogen in our water? What are the factors in your view? And then, of course, we want to get to, okay, what does this mean for parents and how to maximize the best outcomes for their kids?
Well, I mean, the first piece is, do you have attachment security? The second piece that I think is really important is, do you have a supportive community? I mean, we've lost community. We don't live in extended family community. So if our mother and father have to work, we don't have our grandmother and our aunts. We don't have lots of people around us that love us. We may have people that care about us, but we don't have people that love us. So the loss of community, the loss of faith, if you look at the Harvard study, the idea that kids whose parents take them to faith-based communities or services every week do better in terms of their mental health than the kids who don't grow up with faith. There's social media. There's the fact that we have taken our childhood away from our children. We have reversed things. So we project onto very young children that they're independent and self-sufficient and can handle a lot of stress. And then when they get older, we infantilize them. We treat them like they're babies and we baby them. We have to reverse that back. So we treat infants like infants, and children we start to give more freedom so they can develop resilience, right? And when they're very young, we also take their childhood away from them because we take play away. So somewhere along the way, we got confused that the way to create successful children was to force cognitive learning into them at a young age, reading, writing, and arithmetic at a young age, before their brains are capable of handling it. So the way I would put it is that your right brain, your social emotional brain, is like your socks. You always want to put on the socks before you put on your shoes. You don't want to put on your shoes and then try to put your socks over your shoes. So what we've done is we've reversed it. We teach kids at a very young age to sit in circle time, to learn their letters, to learn their numbers, and the kids accommodate, but then they break down. Because in truth, what they need to be doing is what we call free play and imaginary play. Because what that does is it helps to develop the right brain, which then helps them to deal with the frustration tolerance necessary to learn. To learn cognitive learning, you have to be able to tolerate a lot of frustration. Frustration tolerance and emotional regulation come from the right brain. So right brain first, left brain next, but we've reversed that. So we've taken play out of education. Most education is cognitive-based in the early years, not play-based. Later on, we've also taken play away from kids. We force them into structured activities. We don't give them time. Even sports are wonderful. That's a structured activity. We don't give them time to hang out, to draw, to read, to sit in the backyard and dream, we don't give them space to play when they're older. So we've taken playtime away because what we've done is we've projected onto them that they're adults and they don't need to play, but they do need to play and they're not like adults. Social media, as I said, is a terrible thing for a number of reasons. One is that it stimulates the dopamine producing parts of the brain. And what we know is that adolescents produce much more dopamine in response to stimulation than adults. You sit an adult in front of a video game. That adult is going to produce 1/10 of the dopamine of the adolescent sitting next to them. So that means that adolescent is ripe for addiction, right? So we overwhelm our kids with stimulation, right? We have drugs and alcohol too readily available. If you look at the world, it's become an overstimulating, loud, noisy place, right? And what we know is that social media can lead to addiction. But the other thing that people don't know is that it stimulates the threat sensing part of the brain. The amygdala is the regulator of stress in your brain, tiny little almond-shaped part of your limbic system. And what social media does is it turns on the threat sensing part of your brain to believe that there's a threat that isn't there. So, which is why particularly girls, but boys too in social media, will go into states of heightened self-consciousness, fear of social retribution. There's so many bad things with social media, but it's not, I want to say it very carefully, it is not the cause of this crisis. It is a contributing, exacerbating factor in this crisis. So, and there's many more, but that's just a handful. I guess the one I didn't mention is we also have created a highly pressurized environment for kids, sort of like growing hothouse tomatoes. You know, that expression, growing a hothouse tomato. We've basically created an environment where success is defined by grades, by getting into the best schools, by getting the best job, by making the most money from a very young age, when kids are not supposed to be even thinking about the future. At 12, 13, 14 years old, remember, they're supposed to be here, playing and present. They're now thinking about, what am I going to get into college? Am I going to get a job? And it puts them into a threat mode.
As I've shared on the show before, I'm very picky about my skincare routine. In fact, I've tried many products over many years and never landed on a product line, a brand that I really love. And then I discovered NimiSkincare.com. That's Nimi Skincare.com. Nimi Skincare is a company that shares our values. It's pro-family and pro-life, but it also is a high-quality, clean skincare brand based on decades of research. They use clinically proven ingredients, and they've got incredible products. Go to NimiSkincare.com today. Check out their lines. I love how simple the products are to use. I love that the ingredients are clean. I really enjoy the hydration cream as well as their brightening sunscreen that I use every single day. I know you or the woman in your life will love their products. So go to NimiSkincare.com today. Use the code Lila at checkout for 15% off your order. That's NimiSkincare.com, and you can use the code Lila at checkout for 15% off your order. Okay, there's so much to unpack with what you just said. I actually took notes, so I got to ask more about this, about that. One thing that you didn't include in just what you shared, and you said there are many other factors that you didn't say, but I'm curious your thoughts on it. I know we have questions on this too, is the impact of divorce and separation on children, adolescents, of course, but also any age child, and how to, I want to hear kind of your thoughts on the impact of it, and then also the strategies for the parents who are separated for how to maximize success for their kids. Most kids today, my understanding is, are being raised in a household where it's not intact. So they have separated parents or divorced parents or parents who were never together to begin with. And so this is a commonplace, several decades ago, this was not the case in this country. This is a commonplace experience for your average kid.
So interestingly, I'm writing a book about divorce right now.
Wonderful. Can't wait to have you on again to talk about it.
Why do I write books? I write books because I see a problem that no one has really addressed. And for me, divorce is not ideal. And we should be able to talk about the ideal. What's ideal is two parents who love each other, respect each other, admire each other, and love raising children together. That's the ideal. Unfortunately, there's a lot of people in this world who are not the ideal. And so we don't want to condemn them, but we want to say there are ways to divorce where you minimize the harm to your children and maximize the resilience, right? And I think right now, most people don't do it well. Divorce causes so much pain in parents that they translate their pain. They pass their pain along to their children rather than protecting their children from their pain. And so, what I would say is divorce is not ideal. We don't want to ever say that it's good for children, but I will say to you that living in a state of intense conflict with two parents who hate each other or can't get along or are abusive to one another is far worse for children. So what I say is a good divorce is better than a really bad marriage. Having said that, divorce is not ideal. So if we can, we try to make our marriages better. We try to raise our children in an environment that's loving and healthy. But if we can't, then it's better to get divorced, but in such a way that you don't pass that pain on to your children.
Are you concerned, and I see this, pop culture is easy to criticize, but I see, we are lovingly separating after 5 years of marriage or 20 years of marriage, and, we love each other so much, but we're separating lovingly. You see these sort of statements put out by celebrities, right? And, I have the concern that, like you just said, a terrible marriage where there's constant conflict and fighting is arguably worse than a good divorce, for whatever that means, a good divorce, which I want to hear you unpack that. But my question is this: if you are a couple who is divorcing and because you just couldn't, there's not serious abuse in the picture, it's not like you're fleeing an abusive situation. There's just like, you're not working it out, right? You have a lot of competing interests. You're not working it out. You fell out of love, right? Does that attitude and the lack of sort of commitment and intentionality you brought to the marriage, is it possible leaving a marriage for those reasons to then go and have the good divorce and go and raise those kids well when you're bringing with you yourself as a parent who struggle with the intentionality, the commitment, and maybe the self-sacrifice?
I mean, I think every parent who, I'm going to use this word, I want to be careful and sensitive, but every parent who feels they failed at marriage has to live with that feeling. And, what I say is you need to go into therapy. So it doesn't feel as much of a failure as it does a mistake. And we can get over mistakes. It's harder to get over failures if we feel they're failures. And I think the parents who, with great intentionality, deal with their own pain, can move on to really prioritize their children. So here I am again. So it seems to be my tagline with all of my books: prioritize your children. So if you can work out your marriage, then work out your marriage, because that would be, if it can be a good enough marriage, it doesn't have to be a perfect marriage, then that prioritizes your children. But if there is no way to do that, meaning you're in an abusive relationship, you're with a mentally ill person, or, you're seriously unhappy and depressed in that relationship, then that is not a good model for children. So what I say is the best model for children is that loving relationship. So we want children to experience what relationships are supposed to be at some point in their lives. And if you stay in a very unhappy relationship, let's say you have tried to work it out and you stay just for the children, the experience of those children may in fact be that that's what an intimate relationship looks like. And then we get generational expression of unhappiness and disconnect in relationships. So there's no black and white answer. I'm going to go back to what I said originally. The ideal is a happy marriage between two people who try to work things out, who can deal with conflict, who don't run from conflict, who stay and fight for their marriage when they can. And if they have done all the fighting they can, not fighting each other, but fighting together for their marriage, and they can't work it out, then the best is to have a divorce where you prioritize your children.
It's a controversial opinion because, I was talking to Dr. John Deloney on the show a few weeks back, and, my position is, if you're going into it, and again, if there's not a severe abuse or something that is dangerous, for those living in the household, then you work it out. Like you set your mind on, passionately, I'm going to work this out, because I think in the end, love is a choice. Are you describing something where in these cases, are you referring to maybe some incompatibility you perceive, or something where it's, even though they're both trying really hard to work it out, they can't? I mean, what do those cases look like to you? And then obviously that impact on the kid, what that impact is on that kid.
The best way I can describe it is people get married for a variety of reasons at a variety of different times in life. And often people who, not always, people get married before they know themselves very well, meaning they'll marry when they're not fully developed themselves. And in the best case scenario, couples will then develop together. They'll track each other and they'll develop, side by side together. But in the worst case scenario, they develop in very different directions. So they're no longer compatible, maybe because they chose each other and chose to commit to one another before they actually knew who they would be as a grown-up. And so that happens quite often. I do agree with you that I think marriage is worth fighting for. Marriage is the best environment for children, and it's worth fighting for. And so I always encourage couples who come to see me for couples therapy not to give up easily. Often they'll come to me thinking they're coming to separate. You go to couples therapy not just to stay together. Sometimes you go to separate. And usually what happens is I at least get them in a dialogue about their relationship and how they really tried in every way to try to work it out. So the ideal is to come back together with greater understanding and greater compassion for one another, greater acceptance of one another. But it doesn't always happen. So a book like mine, unfortunately, has to exist because divorce exists. So, but the ideal is marriage.
So a couple questions coming from the perspective of people who are navigating separation. And we can have a longer conversation maybe on this in the future because there's so much here. And I do want to get back to kind of what you laid out as the kind of big picture of mental health crises for kids and how to solve that. But let's say you're in a separated relationship and there was, if not straight up abuse, there was certainly other factors that were very unhealthy. And so whether you chose the divorce or the separation or not, you are in a separation, and dealing with the children in that area, maybe there's a custody dispute. In addition to that, there's financial issues. You're just wanting to limit the damage. You're just wanting to limit the damage to your child or your children. What's your advice to that spouse who's helpless, maybe in a court battle, against a court battle, or a spouse they feel is being very unreasonable, an ex-spouse, to minimize the damage for the children that they love so much?
Well, I mean, the way I would describe it is, sometimes you have to fight for your children. If your spouse is mentally ill or, there's serious issues there, or you feel that your children are unsafe, you have to go to battle. But the best divorce is one where it limits the conflict. It sort of keeps the conflict to a minimum. So I always say things like mediation, and before you go into a hot and heavy court battle, that parents keep their perspective that divorces harm children when they are contentious divorces. They really do harm children in so many ways. Loyalties are split. Children feel tremendous losses, not only the loss of the nuclear family, but they often feel the loss of one or both of their parents as a result. So, it's devastating. It's traumatic. Divorce, there's no doubt that divorce in and of itself can be traumatic to children. How you minimize that is you reduce the amount of conflict when possible, and you process every adversity, every conflict. So, there's different views. I guess there's different views of God. And I always say this because, you can either view God as someone who's there just always protecting you and pulling the strings, like the puppet master who's just, going to control everything. Or you have a different view, which is that God created you and you have self-determination, but believing in God helps you to get through the adversity. So I think of that with kids because parents can't always protect their children from all pain, What they can do is help them to get through the pain. And so one way that you do that is to not impose your pain on them. If you're angry at your spouse, you don't talk about being angry at your spouse. If you are feeling hateful feelings, you bring that to your therapist. You don't bring that to your children. You don't disparage the other partner because they need a mother and a father, right? And so in so many ways, there are things that you can do to mitigate the pain to your children, identifying their feelings and helping them to process those feelings, letting them be sad and angry. And, you can't necessarily stop their pain or stop it from happening, but you can be empathic and sensitive and help them to process those feelings.
I hear a lot of cases of people who feel that they're beyond the point of being able to trust this ex-partner spouse. And so the idea of sort of speaking well of the ex-partner spouse to the child, or pretending that they aren't extremely anxious when this child is going to go stay with the ex-partner spouse. What advice would you give to that person who's worried about their child being injured, maybe not physically damaged, but to be otherwise emotionally, psychologically harmed by this spouse. But it's not something that they've proven or can prove in court. It's just their experience of the spouse, of the ex-spouse.
I mean, I believe in something called forensics, which is, it's the psychologists intervening on behalf of the children and really analyzing the situation. So what is best for the child is chosen. But I think if you really believe that your spouse is mentally ill or is going to do harm to your children, you fight like hell. You fight like hell. And you cannot be passive in that situation. So that's the exception, right? We're not talking about two reasonable, amicable people divorcing who both love their children and both are healthy enough. We're talking now about a spouse who may be mentally ill or abusive and maybe an alcoholic, maybe a drug addict. And in that case, you fight like hell.
EveryLife.com is America's fastest growing diaper company, and they're also America's pro-life diaper company. These products are high quality, premium baby products that are great for your little one's skin. And they also support the pro-life movement by donating money back to support mothers and babies in need. You can join a subscription service and get your diapers and wipes sent directly to your door. Check out their products. They're awesome. They're better than Pampers or Huggies or these competitors. And Pampers and Huggies and many of these competitors are pro-abortion companies that support abortion. Every Life, on the other hand, has awesome products at a great price point and supports our values and supports children. So go to everylife.com today. You can use the code Lila at checkout for 10% off your order and get the best products for your little one. That's everylife.com. All right. So much more to go to here in what we were talking about first, laying out the big picture that you did. And, we can maybe do divorce more in the future because there's obviously more to explore there too. But with the time we've got, I wanted to pick up a few threads from earlier, which I thought were really important. You were talking about play and the importance of play for a child. And then you were referring to kind of the school systems or the expectations we have for kids where, it's the hothouse tomato effect, forcing them to grow in a certain way when they're not ready. Is there an age that you recommend that a child should be introduced to what we consider maybe more formal learning? Like this is how now you need to learn to read, to write. Let's start with that. And then I have a lot of follow-up on that.
So until you're 6 years old, you need to just play. And that's a radical thing to say, but that is really the way it was for decades, that you went to nursery school for only 1 year, and it was a few hours a day, a few days a week. That's it. It was just so you get used to being in a group environment, and you didn't do it till you were 4. And then you went to kindergarten, and then you only went half days. You either got the morning slot or you got the afternoon slot. And I remember my mother fought for the morning slot because of my naps. So, but some kids got the afternoon slot. And that way you went 5 days a week to kindergarten, a few hours a day. That's it. And all you did was play. That's all you did.
So do you think the kindergarten experience today versus, decades ago is much more aggressive in the expectation?
Oh my God, you have homework and you're sitting in circle time. So little boys are not meant to sit in circle time. With all that testosterone rolling around in their bodies, they are not meant to sit quietly and learn in a group environment sitting in circle time. And so what it does is it causes them to feel inadequate. It stresses them out. They go into fight or flight. They either become aggressive or they become distractible, and then they're identified as being a problem child. And on it goes. When little boys are meant to learn through playful, tactile, exploratory play. So are little girls, but little girls have a little more of a capacity to sit in circle time, but they too are meant to do a lot of imaginary play. Little boys and little girls are meant to play. You learn through play. You learn about conflict resolution through play. You work through certain troubling emotions through play. And, so play is a very important thing. We lost play. We lost childhood. We basically turned our very young children. We projected onto them that they were older than they actually are, that they were just like us. They're not just like us. They're children. And so kindergarten was play. In fact, kindergarten means the garden of children. a garden, right? And then by the time you were 6 or first grade, you started to learn your letters and your numbers. And, that's when, for decades, that's the way it was done. And then it changed when society became almost frenetic about competition, and children had to, get into the best and be the best, and sort of kind of the almost a hunger for exceptionalism. Like I call it the democratization of exceptionalism, where every child had to be exceptional. So childhood went to the wayside, and children are suffering because of this, right? Because remember, to learn cognitively, you need to be able to tolerate a lot of frustration, and frustration tolerance comes from play.
This makes me think about the Instagram accounts of parents who are bragging about their kid learning to read at age 3 or 2 even. And how they've, and I remember looking at it, it's kind of interesting. It seems a little bit cool maybe, but my impression is they're building a strong bond with their child because they're finding ways to have their child play, and they're bonding with their child through it. So they're kind of doing this trick, and the end result is they have this child who can read, but really it's about bonding and playing with their child in this particular format that they've developed that maybe works for some kids, but maybe definitely wouldn't work for other kids.
Yeah. Again, what happens is children will learn. Just to be clear, you can teach children cognitive skills at a very young age. What happens is they collapse. And so there are studies to show that children who are given a very good base of social emotional play in the beginning are long-term, sustainable, more successful learners than the children who are forced to learn so early, because what happens is they have breakdowns.
This makes me more than ever grateful for being homeschooled, Erica, because a lot of my childhood was play. I mean, we have our own issues in our family, but there was a lot of unstructured time to play and to explore and to read and to just be. And I think that there's such a value to that. I think you're right. We forget this often. What would be some tools you'd recommend that parents use when they're trying to select for a preschool or a kindergarten, or even, for, elementary school, grade school, for how they can identify schools that are going to be more play-based or more conducive to the child's development?
Ask them how they feel about play, and ask them if they allow for imaginary play in the classroom, and ask them how long they have to sit in circle time. It's fine to have a circle time as long as it's a quickie, where you sit down and you have a short time in circle time. But the majority of it is free play or manipulative play or imaginary play. Ask them. The other thing you want to ask is, how do they handle separation, particularly with preschool, right? Many preschools are very insensitive about separation and the separation process, and they don't even see it as a process. They say, leave the kid. They're crying. They'll be just fine. You leave, and we'll take care of them. They're fine once you go. And that's an insensitive approach. So separation, a child who's been home with their mother, is a process. It's a weaning process, and it takes at least 2 weeks of the mother being present in the classroom so the child can do what we call emotional refueling, right? We know the ability to go toddle off and explore and come back and get a hug, and toddle off and explore and come back and look back at the mother. That process is really important to create a secure base in that classroom, right?
A lot of classrooms, they don't even allow the parent in physically. They don't want the parent there because it's too complex or hard for them to deal with that.
But this should be the first 2 weeks of a child's school experience. And if you want them to love school, then you don't want to make school into a traumatic experience. You want it to be easing them into, weaning them away from you and easing them into separating from you for short periods of time. So sensitive schools treat separation sensitively. So you start in the classroom, you start to move closer to the door. Eventually you're outside the door, but they know you're outside the door. If they're in distress, they can come to you. You go down into the cafeteria and you wait down there. If they need you, they call you. you do this for 2 weeks. You take 2 weeks off of work, or if you're home with other kids, stay at school for 2 weeks. Ask them how they handle separation. So
have you seen that successfully done, Erica? I think a lot of parents will say, like, that sounds impossible. The school won't let me do that. I can't take the 2 weeks off. I mean, have you seen that done?
Yes, it is done. It's done in, as I said, sensitive, empathic environments. The other thing that you can ask is how many hours are required of a child. The idea that children in preschool should never start preschool before 3 years of age. I'm going to repeat that again. Children should never start preschool until 3 years of age. Anything under 3 years of age is daycare. And I think from our last time of talking, you know how I feel about daycare. Mm-hmm. So 3 years is a good time because now they're starting to play with other children before 3 years of age. First of all, they need their mothers for security, but they also are doing parallel play. So at about 3, they can play with each other, which is the whole point. And then you want to wean them into short hours. So the idea of 3 days a week for 2.5 hours each day is enough for a 3-year-old. That's plenty. At most, maybe 2.5 hours, 5 days a week, but no more than that. And then by the time they're 4, most preschools ramp it up. So they're getting ready for the way school is structured. And they do, 9 to 1, 9 to 2. But at 3 years of age, all they need is a half day, either in the morning or the afternoon, not even every day. So look for schools that are like that. Sweet, nurturing, sensitive, empathic, play-based schools that handle separation well and are not forcing you to leave your child in school for hours and hours.
What's the role, I don't want to leave the adolescents out of this since we promised to talk about them throughout this episode. What's the role of play? You mentioned exploration as one of the stages of adolescence, the first stage. But what is the role of play for an adolescent? Because, the school system for middle school and high school, you're talking heavy duty days, you're talking late night homework, typically you're talking, SATs, and you're preparing to try to get into the college, and you have your extracurriculars. And I do think it can be very overwhelming. I'm from the Bay Area, San Jose, and there's regular occurrence of these kids. They say they have tiger moms or whatever the pejorative phrases, but or term is, but they are killing themselves. They're at the wealthiest, most highly accomplished high school, one of them in the Bay Area, highest rates of acceptance to Ivy Leagues, and regularly the kids walk themselves over the train tracks and they die because they cannot handle the stress.
Okay, so I'm going to say something that's very controversial, but you are not a stranger to it, and I'm not a stranger to it. So any high school that demands that your child has more than 2 to 3 hours of homework a day, and that could also be the homework that they do while they're in school. A lot of kids do it during study hall and on the bus. Any school that demands more than 2 to 3 hours a day, you should pull your child out of. Period. So does that mean that other kids around them have different numbers of hours that they work? That may be. But for your child, if your child is not able to do their homework in 2 to 3 hours a day, pull them out of that school.
What about extracurriculars? What if they're not, maybe they're kind of managing to mostly get it done, but they've got these other things, the marching band, or I don't know, again, I was homeschooled. I had a very unorthodox, I guess, upbringing in my education, but the many sports, music, whatever, and all of a sudden every single hour of the day they're rushing to something.
So I think it's an exercise in executive functioning. It's the beginning of executive functioning. Remember, executive functioning is a right brain function. So remember I said your right brain isn't fully developed till you're 25. Part of that is executive functioning. It doesn't fully develop till you're about 25. But that executive functioning dictates how you manage your time, how much you can handle, knowing how much you can handle. I mean, I know you're a busy woman, I'm a busy woman, and the idea that we can't do everything, but we know what our limits are. Kids don't know their limits. So one thing I would say is just be on the lookout for binging on activities or not doing any activities, meaning they don't always know how to regulate. So some activity is important for them, but kids often don't know how to regulate how much activity outside of school. So, for instance, if your kid comes to you and says, I want to do volleyball, tennis, and baseball. I want to play the violin. I want to play the flute. I want to march in the band, this kind of, and you say, you know what? Isn't it better to do one or two things well, where you have space and time, than to do 6 things, right? And, part of the issue has been that it's part of this success formula that we've created for adolescents, that they have a resume by the time they're like 13 years old. I didn't even know what the word resume meant till I got out of college, So to have a resume means you have to do 6 activities all at once. This is why our kids are breaking down. The idea is that you have to help your children. They can pick their own activities first and foremost. They should be picking their activities, not you. But you also teach them about time management and about executive functioning. It's not something that comes naturally to them.
If you're dealing with an adolescent who is, type A, I'm just going to provide these 2 hypotheticals because I know they're common. And then there's stuff to get to more beyond this, that some other questions that came in about adolescence that I want to make sure we get to, but that were really good. But let's say you have the high performing kid, right? Who's like just on steroids, getting stuff done, trying to be the best, trying to get the best grades. And they're kind of the good kid, they're kind of the good kid. So you as a parent are thinking, you don't want them to work too hard, but you're kind of proud of them, and they're also pretty well behaved. So you don't think there's attachment issues, or they don't seem to be rearing their ugly head. What would be some things to be cautious about maybe as a parent with a kid like that? Because, obviously you don't want to see a crash and a burn, or you don't want to see suddenly that kid, you didn't see the signs, and there is some dramatic event that is damaging in their behavior or self-harm. You find out something really terrible that the child's been involved in. What would be advice for the parent dealing with a kid like that? And also in the context of this attachment stuff too, because maybe this parent is like, am I good? Are we good? They seem to be interacting with me fairly harmoniously. What would be just your advice for the parents?
You want to look for balance. It's very important that just like in an adult, you want to look for balance, but particularly in an adolescent, you want to look for balance. That they have friends is the most important thing, more important than grades, but that they have good enough grades that they feel good about it. So the problem is that we've created a system where kids can only feel good about their grades if they're straight A's. So when I was growing up, there were 3 straight A students in a class of 300, 400. And the rest were, A's and B's and B pluses, maybe a C, and right. So today, 45% of kids in high school are A students. Doesn't make sense, does it? If you think about what's happened. So what you want to look for is balance. They have friends, they have a social life, they have interests and other activities outside of school, and that the pressure on themselves to get grades is modest and moderate, that they're not hoping that they're going to be a straight A student, but that they do the best that they can do. And so sometimes that's an A, sometimes that's a B. And you look for that kind of perfectionism, the obsessiveness over school or activity, and that's something to watch. And you also want to look for things, if you want to know symptom-wise, what you look for to know that your child may be having a difficult time. You look for any shifts or changes in mood, any shifts or changes in socializing, any shifts or changes in grades. If they went from being an A minus, B plus, or B student to being a C or D student, that's a marker of something. If their sleep or their eating dramatically changes, so you're looking for any real shifts in either behavior or mood.
What would be your practical advice for the parent of the adolescent who is trying to do what you're describing, and maybe they're dealing with the hyperachiever, or maybe they're dealing with the kid in the doldrums, or any number of they're dealing with rebellion issues, whatever it might be, and they want to connect. They really want to connect with their kid, and they're struggling to find a way to do that. I was at a restaurant recently with my husband and our kiddos, and we were having, it was like a Sunday, afternoon, early evening dinner, and a little pizza joint. And I couldn't help but notice a mother there with her daughter, and the daughter was, she had her piercings and her cool kind of outfit and her kind of crazy hair. And, she's like a 14, 15-year-old just looking at her phone. And the mother was very kind of prim and proper. She had her salad. The girl had her pizza. They were drinking their drinks. And I could see that mother desperately trying to connect with her daughter. I don't mean to laugh at it. It was a beautiful expression. I'm reading into what I perceived, but I sensed that the mother really wanted to connect. And this was, going out to pizza dinner was this attempt. And the daughter was not connected back.
Right. So there have to be rules. One rule of engagement is no phones at the table. I think that's a good rule to have. Mm-hmm. And that's not even a rigid thing to ask. It's just no.
I'm going to guess it was a source of controversy between these two, just based on what I saw.
Yeah, but you have to start that early. The rules have to be started from the beginning. You can't just impose them when your child is 15. You have to do it from the time you give them a flip phone. You shouldn't give them a smartphone until they're 14 or 15, and they should only have, if they have any phone, a kind of flip phone or a Google phone, which has no social media on it. But even then, you want to say no phones at the table. But here's the way I put it in my book, and I will.
But one question, just to clarify, you're saying they can have a smartphone at 14, or you're saying they can have a flip phone at 14?
No, meaning until they're 14 or 15, children should not have any smartphones. If you choose to give them a phone, you wouldn't do it until a smartphone. You wouldn't do it until they're about 15 years old. In my opinion, that's the earliest that you'd want to give them a smartphone. In terms of, so that doesn't mean that you have to give them a smartphone. It just means that if you're going to give them a smartphone, that would be the soonest you'd want to give it to them. In my book, I talk about when the door opens, your children are open to communicate with you. And I think what most parents think is, I'm going to be there when I want to be there, and my child has to be there on my terms. So the first thing I'll say to parents is, it has to be on their terms. And so the more you're around, double dutch, that jump rope game the kids play, double dutch, I think it's called, where you have to kind of catch the wave, you have to jump in at the right moment. If parents are around physically and emotionally enough, then when their child's door opens, when their teenager's door opens, physically, their real door, but also when they're open to communicating, maybe it's a transitional point, maybe they're done with their homework and they're ready to eat dinner, or maybe they've just come home from school and they want a snack before they go down and study. If you're there to make them a snack, or to sit at the table with them, or, if you're there when the door opens, they take a bathroom break and you say, hey, how you doing? Then they're going to be more open. But if you come home from work or wherever you've been and you walk into their room and you say, hey, how you doing? They're going to shut the door in your face. Because the way that adolescents' defenses work is that they open and close, open and close. And it's how they keep the balance of separation and closeness with you, right? So they can't be open all the time, because then they can't leave, they can't separate, they can't individuate. So they open and close. If you're there when they open, great, you catch the wave, and then they close again. But if you come in on your terms and on your time and say, I'm home, I'm ready to communicate and be here for you, they're going to shut the door in your face. So the way that you get close to your children is by being around enough that you catch the wave.
So I'm, again, reading into the scenario earlier, again, I don't know to judge them personally because I don't know, but let's say theoretically you're saying, oh, I'm going to take my kid out, my son or daughter out for pizza once a week, and I'm going to walk into the room after work and say, how are you doing? Slap him on the back. That's not a recipe for success, because you're saying I've got the door open on my terms, on my timeline. Otherwise, I'm unavailable, and you better be responsive to me when I want you to respond to me. And that sends the wrong message to the child, and the child won't be able to reciprocate that.
That's right. So it's got to be on their terms, and in their time.
And in their time. It's so good. All right. This is where I want to land us here. This has been such another fantastic conversation. There's so much food for thought here. I got a lot of questions from children of parents, of course, who are adult children, young adult children, about how to talk to their parents now, whom they love, about the attachment issues they feel. And, there's one here, I'll just read it as an example. It says, as an adult, and I almost tear up saying this because, it just shows the audience that listens to this podcast are really intentional people that want to repair relationships and build healthy families and, be loving and be forgiving. But it just shows there's a lot of woundedness in young adult children who become more self-aware about their own journeys and realize, hey, there's stuff in my childhood that was really tough, but they love their parents. They want to be in good terms with their parents. So as an example, I got this question. As an adult, how do you approach a parent about your past with your parent without making them feel bad or like they made mistakes so you can heal and not repeat the unhealthy cycles from your childhood? So I think they're delicately asking this. It sounds like there were issues in their childhood. They're not even wanting to throw the parent under the bus and say there were issues, but how do you approach your parents? Because you want repair with them, but there were issues in your childhood.
Well, it sort of puts the child in the position of having to think about the parent. And I don't know how old these children are. These are adult children. So
these are, let's say, adult children. I didn't get ages on all the questions, of course, but
30s.
Let's say like late 20s, early 30s.
So, listen, the truth will set you free is the expression. And so you have to be honest, and you can say, I have feelings that I haven't shared with you. And I'm afraid that if I don't share those feelings with you, we'll never be as close as we could be. And that they, by not expressing those feelings, it's getting in the way of me having a closer relationship. And I know that you want to have a close relationship to me. So this is what's getting in the way. And I feel that you need to hear how I feel about things in my childhood that I never expressed to you.
And if the child is met with perhaps especially for a parent who has their own damage, a defensiveness of, oh, I'm a horrible parent. I oh, woe is me. The parent kind of makes it about them. Woe is me, woe is me. And the child feels like now they're just literally punishing the parent to even bring these things up. What would you recommend?
Well, I guess you can say, it sounds like you're really having a hard time hearing my pain. I'm sure you have your own pain too, but it sounds like you're really just having a hard time listening to my pain.
And if it devolves from there, is then the advice, this is not the time for this deeper relationship that you hope to have. At least they're not ready yet.
Yeah, you can say, it sounds like we can't have this conversation now because it's too painful for you to hear about my pain. And when you're ready to hear about my pain, it could make us closer. And remember, the carrot at the end of the stick for your parents is the closeness of the relationship. Mm-hmm. So there is a manipulation to it, yes, but it's a good way to go about it.
Is there work that adult children can do to deal with this pain that they use the term my pain, so that they're not expecting too much of a parent who has their own frailties, but that they can still discover a deeper relationship with the parent?
Well, therapy, individual therapy that is psychodynamic. I'm a psychoanalyst. So the kind of therapy that I do with patients, individual therapy, is really focused on healing the inside of that patient. It's not that I don't focus on the real relationships, but if you have an adult, sometimes their parents are passed away. Sometimes their parents, they're alienated from their parents. Sometimes they can't repair in a real way, but they can repair internally. So we have two sets of parents. We have our real parents, and then we have the parents that we carry around inside of us every day who talk to us in our head, right? You'd say the voices in our head, our mother, our father, and they're usually exaggerations of our real parents. But to say that when you go to therapy, although, yes, some therapy is about healing the dynamics in relationships, getting you to be able to talk to your mother, your real father. Most of the time, therapy is about healing the myth of your parents inside of you. healing the internal and the mother and the internal father. And that is probably the most powerful thing, because those are the parents that you will carry around with you till the day you die.
Do you think it's possible to experience a deep closeness with a parent without going over the gory details of some of the difficult things that happened? What would you recommend? You know, if someone's listening, they're like, and by gory, you know, that could mean many different things. I'm more speaking to just like, you know, issues of the parents being imperfect and, you know, your kind of list of, you know, maybe at times emotional neglect or overreactions or anxieties or stresses or conflict that was just hard to navigate as a kid. What's kind of the general advice that you have for that child seeking harmony and love with their parents, but they don't necessarily know that the best tack is to try to take the parent on this super deep dive of the past?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think that we always try to heal our real relationships. So I think it's always, you want to try to heal real relationships, but I think that's, in the end, you try, but that's not the goal. The goal is to heal yourself. If you can heal the real relationships, that's wonderful. But in the end, the most important thing is to heal yourself, so you can live the best life that you can live and make maybe better choices in terms of relationships in the future than you were given in the past. So if you had an attachment disorder because your mother was negligent or wasn't interested or was depressed, then the idea is to heal internally so you can go forward into life and make better choices with the partner that you choose and the friends that you choose. And so, yeah, it's not that I don't emphasize the real relationship with one's mother and father. I do think that if you can talk to your parents about the history and the pain, it can really help tremendously. It can also harm if parents are defensive and aggressive and dismissive. And so it's individual, but I would say the main goal of therapy is to heal what's inside so you can go forward and live the best life you can live and be the best person you can be.
Thank you, Erica. So much wisdom, so many gems in this conversation as usual. Any final words, especially on the from the Chicken Little, the sky is not falling, second chances perspective that you want to share for folks listening?
Just that all is not lost. I know people hear me speak about the first 3 years in different contexts. And, I never talk about the first 3 years without saying where there's life, there's hope. And at any point that you can get to repair the relationship with your child is a good point. And so at whatever point you enter, it makes a difference. So don't give up hope.
Thank you, Erica. Where can people find your work?
www.komisar, KOMISAR.com. And you can see my books there and other things that I've written, and it's all on my website.
Wonderful. Well, thanks so much again for joining. It's been great to talk. Thank you, Erica.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode with Erica Komisar. I hope you enjoyed it. Erica always gives me so much food for thought and inspires me to be a better parent. I hope that was the effect for you. As always, I love to hear from you. Don't forget, you can always email me at lila@gtbmedia.com. I love hearing from you guys, and you can check out our Patreon and our locals communities, become a monthly subscriber and supporter of the show. It helps the show reach more people, and you can communicate with us over there. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.